The Thunder Run, slideshow movie by Jarod Fernandes and Abby Edge. Preparation for the invasion of Baghdad. U.S. troops encircled in 2003. A quick assault called a Thunder Run was proposed by Colonel David Perkins. They were eager to avoid anything that would become a dangerous urban warfare. He decided to only use his men while invading Baghdad, which was a total of fewer than 1,000 men. A Thunder Run is a quick, daring thrust into and out of enemy territory. His men staged one day before, pushing their tanks and armed personnel carriers into Baghdad airport, killing several hundred defenders, and then withdrawing to safety before nightfall. Colonel Perkins stated, "If the condition's right, I can stay the night. If I can stay the night, I can stay forever. If I'm in the city and I stay there, the war is over." Important people, aka major players. Saddam Hussein. He was the bad guy in the eyes of the White House. He survived all assaults against him. He was also a evicted United Nations weapons inspector. Colonel David Perkins. He was the commander that led the assault, aka Thunder Run, into Baghdad. He was very eager to invade Baghdad. President Bush. He was the President of the United States from 2000 to 2008. He was convinced by himself and other officials that Saddam Hussein needed to be taken out of power. He was also told that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. This is why he invaded Iraq and went after Saddam. The CIA/FBI. They investigated Saddam Hussein and Iraq. They also helped provide some evidence so that the invasion of Iraq could be justified to the American people and the rest of the world. For an example, the CIA agent George Tenet showed President Bush and other officials aerial surveillance of a weapons plant in Iraq. Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was determined to finish business in Iraq. He wanted to invade Iraq and was trying to convince the American people it is because of the threat to America, not because there is oil there. Dick Cheney. Just like Rumsfeld, Cheney was also determined to finish business on Iraq. He was President Ford's Secretary of Defense. He was Vice President for Bush and adamant in taking down Saddam.
Involvement with Saddam. He was against America and the fifth president of Iraq. Saddam survived all assaults against him and was a pariah in the eyes of Washington. He also evicted United Nations weapons inspectors. Saddam was a huge dictator in Baghdad. Bush wanted to invade Baghdad because Saddam stated he had many weapons of mass destruction. In Baghdad, Saddam lived in a huge palace complex which was strictly off limits to the public and was built on 2 square miles of land. He had 4 busts that stood at 13 feet high. Saddam had his own military and political elite. Saddam had many defenders who were completely loyal to Saddam, and as the U.S. troops headed into Baghdad, they came across all the defenders. They had no jackets, helmets, or weapons that were powerful enough to harm the troops. This showed how their courage was bordering on fanaticism. America knew that the region would be like without Saddam in power. Rumsfeld stated, but what we really want to think about is going after Saddam. Imagine what the region would look like without Saddam and with a regime that aligned with the U.S. interests. Rumsfeld was sent to meet Saddam and ask him what the America could do to help his cause. Iran and Iraq were in a war, and Reagan didn't want Iran to win the war and began sending Saddam reports about America troops movement, which caused him to escape and fend off what might have been a complete defeat. America then sent him $200 million worth of weaponry and helicopters to help with the war after 7 years had passed. They soon lost trust, and Iraq got support from the Soviet Union. After that, Saddam was planning to attack Kuwait and sent his troops into Kuwait. This caused Saddam to subdue it easily. Over the next 5 months, he assembled a coalition of 34 nations that shared his determination. After After that, America led a coalition on bombing Iraq and Iraqi positions in Kuwait. They invaded Kuwait and Iran. Saddam ordered his soldiers to take pot shots at America's spy planes. America and Iraq had an ongoing feud that happened after that, and America saw Saddam as the most dangerous enemy at the moment and were eager to promote any plan that would result in his overthrow.
Bush's focus on Iraq. Some sources say that Bush focused on Iraq and Saddam because Saddam attempted to have Bush Sr. assassinated after Bush Sr. kicked Saddam out of Kuwait when he was president. President Bush Jr. was told to believe that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that were either chemical, biological, or nuclear. Bush seemed to believe that the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York had a correlation to Saddam Hussein and his regime in Iraq. There was never any solid evidence proving that Iraq was helping out bin Laden or bin Laden was helping out Iraq. Why did America invade Iraq? Invading Iraq was at the top of the White House agenda when Bush became president in 2001. President Bush had a group of advisors that were all for war in Iraq. CIA Director George Tenet showed President Bush, Dick Cheney, which is Bush's vice president, and other senior officials a large aerial surveillance of a plant that produces chemical or biological materials for weapons manufacture in Iraq. Days after this, there was another meeting discussing sanctions in Iraq. This was interrupted by Rumsfeld, who said, "Sanctions are fine, but what we really want to think about is going after Saddam. Imagine what the region would look like without Saddam and a region that is aligned with U.S. interests." This was very important because everyone is being convinced that we need to invade Iraq, when in reality, Iraq was not a threat to America at this time. The Al-Qaeda terror network presented more of a threat to America than Saddam did. Richard Clarke, who wrote an urgent memo to National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice asking for a chance to brief cabinet secretaries and other senior officials with threats posed by Al-Qaeda. This happened a few days after President Bush was inaugurated. Clarke stressed the officials that the Al-Qaeda terror network should be top priority since it presented a threat to America. The officials replied by stating that we should also be worried about Iraqi terrorism. "We have no evidence of any Iraqi terrorism against the U.S., McLaughlin replied. "You give bin Laden too much credit. He could not do all these things like the 1993 truck bomb attack on New York without a state sponsor. Just because the FBI and CIA have failed to find linkages doesn't mean they don't exist," insisted Wolfowitz. This proves that Bush and his advisors were convinced they needed to take down Saddam and his regime. Even though there are bigger threats the White House was addressed with, they still focused on Iraq.
Okay. The invasion. The invasion began with Colonel David Perkins assembling the Thunder Run. They made their way through Baghdad's airports by pushing their tanks and armed men through and made their way in. They would end up killing several hundred defenders. As this stretched to the news in Iraq, they had to come up with a bigger and better Thunder Run that would make a better stretch to get their way through Baghdad. When they got through the other string of defenders, they made their way through and finally invaded Baghdad. Okay. Iraq's response to the invasion. The Iraq army tried to muster up as many forces to defend their homeland as they could. They were dug in the city of Baghdad. They had outdated weapons and very few anti-vehicle weapons that worked.
Involvement of the CIA. The CIA have been working around to find some info about Saddam. The FBI and the CIA have failed to find linkages. It didn't mean that they didn't exist. Soon after, a CIA agent stayed in Baghdad for a week and sent startling news back to America. He knew where Saddam and his two sons had been sleeping that night, which was key info for America. Aftermath. The American people were told that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and they posed a huge threat to the American people, when in reality, Saddam's regime was weak and barely surviving. He did not have weapons of mass destruction. This was sold to the people by President Bush and his advisors. They were provided very little info that Saddam posed a threat to America, but they stretched out this evidence to make it seem like Saddam was a huge threat to America, even though America was in no danger. The government used numbers 4 and 5 from our imperialism notes. Number 4 states that it is to show our country's strength in another region. And number 5 states that it's to civilize, quote-unquote, backwards people and make them like us. Basically take Saddam out of power and make Iraq have American interests.